Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janice Nicholson, and I'm the Director of Communications for the Stem Cell Network. I wanted to welcome everyone to the third session of our Early Career Investigator webinar series. On behalf of the network, I want to thank you all for joining, and I want to give a special shout out to our sponsor for this event, Taycell. Thank you for your support. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to get started by introducing our moderator for today. Dr. Amy Wong is the scientist in the Developmental and Stem Cell Biology program at the Hospital for Sick Children Research Institute. And she's also an assistant professor of laboratory medicine and pathobiology at the University of Toronto. Amy completed her PhD in Toronto in thoracic surgery and regenerative medicine with Dr. Tom Waddell at the University Health Network, and her postdoctoral training at SickKids with Dr. James Ellis and Dr. Janet Bressant, where she focused on iPSC reprogramming and airway epithelial differentiation. She was one of the first to develop a method to differentiate human pluripotent stem cells into lung epithelia, modeling lung developmental pathways and using these cells to model cystic fibrosis. This pioneering work showed that human iPS cell-derived airway epithelia can potentially be used in personalized precision medicine. She's also developed a direct cell reprogramming strategy to generate lung-like progenitor cells directly from fibroblasts. These induced lung-like epithelial cells may serve as an alternative cell source for tissue regeneration. Her lab is using these stem cell models to understand human lung development, lung disease, and therapies. Amy?
Thank you, Janice. And that was a very good introduction. Actually, if I can get that from you later, that would be great. So first, I'd like to welcome you all to the third session of our four-part webinar series designed to cover some of the main challenges and issues investigators tend to face in the early stage of their career. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Stem Cell Network for developing and hosting the series, and special thanks to Taycell for sponsoring the webinar series. I'd like to encourage you all to speak up and ask questions and share your thoughts during the session. It is meant to be interactive, and I promise you our special panel members are incredibly resourceful, and so let's pick their brains a little. To get engaged, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions for our panelists. In the first week of the webinar series, we learned how to set up a successful research lab. Last week, we heard a lot about funding and tips on grant writing. And so today we move a little closer or a little further along the career continuum, and we'll focus on building and maintaining your research reputation. I am so honored to be joined by three distinguished scientists, all highly regarded, top-notch researchers, and excellent role models for us new generation of scientists. So let me introduce our expert panelists. First, we have Vardit Ravitsky, Dr. Vardit Ravitsky. She's an associate professor at the bioethics program within the Department of Social and Preventative Medicine of the School of Public Health at the University of Montreal. She is also director of ethics and health branch of the CRE, an inter-university research center in ethics. She holds a BA in philosophy from Sorbonne University in Paris, an MA in philosophy with a specialization in bioethics from the University of New Mexico in the US, and a PhD in philosophy with a specialization in bioethics from Bar Ilan University in Israel. Vardit's research focuses on reproductive ethics and the ethics of genetic and genomic research. Her research interests in bioethics also include research ethics, health policy, and cultural perspectives. She is particularly interested in the various ways in which cultural frameworks shape public debate and public policy in the areas of bioethics. Welcome, Vardit. Next, we have here Dr. Jim Woodgett. He was recruited to Canada from the UK by the Ontario Cancer Institute in 1992, where his biomedical research laboratory focused on the signaling mechanisms that underscore malignant growth, degenerative diseases, and diabetes. He was an international scholar of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute for 10 years. In 1997, he was appointed head of the Division of Experimental Therapeutics, held the Amgen Chair of Cancer Biology, and became full professor in the Department of Medical Biophysics at the University of Toronto. He is known globally for his work on protein kinases. These molecules have become important drug targets for many diseases, including cancer, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, and type 2 diabetes. He has also initiated and nurtured the first DNA microarray fabrication facility in Canada, which has enabled new developments in biotechnology. In 2005, Jim was appointed the 4th director of the Samuel Linenfeld Research Institute at Mount Sinai Hospital, where he has developed disease models and discovered mechanisms to maintain the pluripotentiality of stem cells. Jim is internationally recognized for his co-discoveries of PKB-AKT and SAPK-JNKs, and is the leading authority in the functions of GSK3 genes. He is an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and holds the Koffler Chair of at Mount Sinai Hospital. Welcome, Jim. And last but not least, we have Dr. Peter Zandstra. Peter graduated with a Bachelor of Engineering degree from McGill University in the Department of Chemical Engineering and obtained his PhD from the University of British Columbia in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Biotechnology. He was a postdoc fellow in the field of bioengineering at MIT before joining the University of Toronto in 1999. His vision is to translate the biological properties and potential of stem cells into useful applications that benefit society. Peter has focused his career on the field of stem cell bioengineering. His lab is focused on the generation of functional tissue from adult and pluripotent stem cells. His group's quantitative bioengineering-based approach strives to gain new insights into the fundamental mechanisms that control stem cell fate and to develop robust strategies for the use of stem cells and their derivatives to treat disease. Specific areas of research focus include stem cell expansion and the generation of cardiac tissue and blood progenitors from pluripotent stem cells. Welcome, Peter. And so before we dive right into questions on how to build your research reputation, perhaps I can start by prefacing with a definition of what I think research reputation means. And maybe you could chime in on whether or not you agree or disagree on the definition, with the definition. So research reputation, to me, has two components, your academic reputation and your personal reputation. The academic reputation perhaps is generally defined as the overall impression of excellence or quality of one's research achievements, as well as one's ability to uphold high standards in research integrity and respect the research guidelines. So examples include whether you've published in high impact journals, are internationally recognized for your research, etc. And then the second part of a research reputation is defined by your personal reputation, which is the widespread belief of what others have of you as a person. So for example, the habits or characteristics that people associate you with, your mentoring style, whether you're a good mentor or not. And so with this, perhaps I'll turn the table to the panelists and see whether or not you agree. And if you have anything else to chime in terms of what we think the definition of research reputation is. Okay. Jim, can we start with you?
Old is first. Age before beauty. I think, you know, it's reputation in science is pretty much what everything is based upon in terms of being successful. To be successful, you need to have others understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, and it takes time, right? So it's a little bit like where there's things you can plan, there's things you can't plan, but you can always set standards for yourself, and you can do that in multiple ways. So for example, because I know most of the audience are early career investigators and postdoctoral fellows and trainees, this is where your reputation starts, right? Because you do want to be known for working and collaborating with other people, and that's a two-way street, right? So you can benefit from it as well as help others. But also, there are things that you don't really necessarily, you shouldn't be thinking about it in a transactional way. I think to be successful really in science, you need to be as open-minded as possible, and to actually listen to others and have a reputation actually for listening, and then helping to speak out to defend them and to support them. And I think, you know, in the past year, I'm sure the conversation is going to come back to the pandemic a number of times. And that's what I think is something which has become even more important as the the means by which we can communicate and interact with other scientists has become more limited. I mean, that's what we're doing right now. Everything has become virtual. Our time is just evaporating in various ways. So how do you make those decisions? How do you maintain the momentum that you've built up? And I think there are things we can do. I'm sure we'll discuss them. But really, it's about making sure that everybody hates email, or they hate replying to this, that, and the other, because you just get deluged with it. But never, I mean, I've never not replied, as far as I know, to somebody who's asked me a question. And it's because, if they're asking you a question, then there's a good reason for it. They think you know the answer. You may not. And that's really important to know when you don't know the answer. But it's that willingness to be open and interactive. And it doesn't matter who you are, right? So, and I was told this, many, many years ago by a couple of my mentors who, this is too long ago. I'm not going to mention when, but they said to me, that you never know who actually you're talking to, because if somebody asks you for a reagent, they could be, in 5 years' time, a huge competitor of yours. You want them to be a friend, not an enemy, or at least to care about what you're thinking and what you're doing. And that's why, and then of course, that's where we learn. We learn tremendously from the literature, of course, but you also learn, we all know that published papers are just the tip of the iceberg. There's a huge amount of knowledge behind those. And the only way you can really understand that knowledge is by talking to the authors and building a relationship with them. So that's why I think both personal reputation and academic reputation go hand in hand. And there are, not everybody's a white knight. There are some people who really are just so intense. And I'm not saying they're bad scientists. They can be incredibly good scientists, can be very, very intense, have time for nobody, and have lousy reputations, but do well. Right, and there are other people who, who simply find it very difficult to interact. They're introverted, or they just feel they've come from a community or from a background where it's very difficult to interact with people. So but there are other ways around that. It doesn't have to be through socializing. It can be through sharing of ideas. So I think it's what we all should be trying to do.
Vardit or Peter?
I agree with every word Jim just said. The last point that you made, Jim, made me think about a distinction that I often make between the knowledge sharers who are generous with ideas, knowledge, time, mentorship, any resource that us researchers have, and what I call the hoarders, those who are so suspicious of others or worried about sharing a preliminary idea in case somebody else takes it and runs with it, or somebody will publish before they do. And I think a lot of building your reputation is about resisting the hoarding mentality and having a generous spirit behind everything you do, and believing that what goes around comes around. And as you said, somebody asks you for something, it may not be right now in your best interest to share it, to give it, but it will come around. And if not directly from that person, then at the level of your reputation. I shared with you guys when we chatted before that in my department, the hiring policy is research excellence, however, no jerks and no divas. So I think that these notions of, we look for people who are really collaborative and generous plays a huge role in how you will be seen eventually, even if it's a long-term game. The other element of reputation that maybe was less mentioned so far, and maybe because it's closer to my research field, which is related to health policy and implementation of innovation, is about what I call leadership. So where can you build a reputation for yourself in terms of the impact of your research, whether through knowledge translation, media work, work with decision makers, or by taking the time to sit on boards, advisory groups, CIHR, various committees. So that's another place to build a reputation, and it takes time away from research. So some people really don't like doing it. But I think beyond being an important contribution to our communities, it's a fantastic way of building reputation, because you become gradually acknowledged as a leader in your field if you're the kind of person that others can rely on for advice, whether it's for policymaking or research funding or designing the scope of future projects, etc. So this entire kind of category of leadership impact, advisory roles, and knowledge translation is another layer of reputation that I would add to the conversation.
Maybe I'll add a few comments. Great discussion already. There's a couple things that strike me. I think something that Jim said about a reputation not being a transactional aspect is really important, and in some ways, for me, you want to think about it as an outward reflection of kind of your inner compass. What's important to you? How do you achieve the goals which are important to you in terms of scientific excellence, in terms of helping community, in terms of, each of us has also goals that are individual to us. Helping Canadian biotech ecosystem has always been one of mine. And so having some clarity about what you believe is as important, and having those reflected in the way that you build your reputation, I think is very important. The second one that I think Vardit and Jim both mentioned are that this is the long game. One thing doesn't build a reputation. A reputation is the sum of many different consistent activities, and many different answering that email or those types of things. So I think setting this foundation is really important as a way to approach it.
Yeah, so thank you all. I think what I'm hearing from all of you is that there are many ways to build your research reputations, and we've heard a few, simple things like answering emails or being involved in policy. Can we talk more a little bit on other ways to build your reputation?
So I think, as Peter just said, it's a long game, and it also changes, right? So things which are important now were not necessarily important 20 years or 30 years ago. And I think one of the issues, certainly, again, I'll bring it up, with the pandemic, although it nobody needs reminding, is that I think a lot of people fear that this is sort of a lost year or a lost 18 months or whatever it's going to be. But in fact, that's really not the case, because everybody's in the same situation or very similar situations. And I should be very careful there. I mean, it's clearly this pandemic has affected some people far more than others, especially people who've got young kids, for example. It's not affecting everybody similarly, but everybody knows, right? So it's not as though this is you have to explain the pandemic to anybody. Everybody on Earth understands this. So it's not, people should not think about the 2020 as a lost year, 2021 as a lost year, but rather that it's a joint experience. So I think, you need to, and that's important, because you have to, we always think that reputations are always building. It's something, going in one direction, it's going up, but that's not the case, because you do need to work at it, right? You need to be reaching out. And it's also because, people do disappear, and they do that because, especially in academia, there are lots and lots of opportunities which are outside academia. And so, but that doesn't mean that people don't come back. And it also doesn't mean that the interactions that you've had, even if you're not still within academia, are not relevant and important. And Peter mentioned biotech, for example. There's a large number of people, the majority of people who are trained for a PhD don't go on to become a professor. They will go on to hopefully use their skills in many other areas. And that can even include, government labs and even policy places, that sort of thing. So those sort of those relationships are incredibly important, because cold calling is very inefficient. But if you've got a personal connection with somebody, especially when you've got a shared experience, which you can discuss and you can bring somebody up to date. It's everybody wants to hear about those, right? I think that's the only reason that Facebook actually really exists, is because people do want to keep in touch with other people, and it's because it's interesting. So I think that when we talk about how to nurture your reputation, it's a little bit like building together in the old days a photograph album where you can put bits and pieces in, pictures, but you don't just put pictures of other people, you put pictures of where you've been and so in other words, your experiences. And it helps to give you some level of perspective. So you learn from yourself. We forget, we're living in the moment looking forward, but in fact, there's lots of things in our past which we learn from. And that's where mentorship is also, we talk about, everybody's got mentors, but there's a lifelong relationships, and they need to be like a fire. They need to be kindled every so often, so they don't go out and people get updated. And especially if you're young and earlier in your career, updating your mentors, if you're a postdoc, letting your PhD supervisor know what you're up to, and including the bad things, the things which are, believe me, they're interested in that. And that's what I want to hear, because I want to know if I can help as well, right? And then you're, of course, you're probably going to be relying on them in the future for letters, and they write much, much better letters when they know what you've been up to. It just makes it more personal. It's so easy to see when somebody has written, and Peter, I'm sure, does this too. Maybe Vardit's doing it. I'll nominate people for various prizes, and you ask people to write letters of support, and you can tell a letter of support if it's just written from a resume, from a CV, compared with where you've got somebody who actually has a relationship. They know the person, they know their reputation, and they'll inject things which are obvious, which are different. And that adds value, because we try with these, it's very infuriating in science. We have these, I don't think actually it's scientists who are doing this, but there's this need, or supposed need, to reduce us to numbers, like an H index or whatever. And in fact, that loss of dimensionality just strips away everything which is interesting. So I think that's why, again, it's about building up a knowledge base and keeping in touch with people. You'll lose people over time, just because we always lose touch. But it's something which is so precious and does need some care and attention. And it's the best time you'll spend is maintaining those connections.
Vardit,
Amy, do you want us to do the tour again?
I think so, yeah.
So again, to follow up straight onto Jim's last idea, one way of doing it is one-on-one, of course, emailing, calling, especially now that we don't get to have coffee and dinner and drinks at conferences, which is invaluable for building these personal connections and allowing people to know you as a person and talk about things that are not work related, and be just a rounder human being than just what you produce and the papers that you write. So now the conferences are gone, and when we're in these little squares, it's harder to do the informal chat and to get to know each other on a more personal basis. So yeah, being proactive one-on-one via email, phone calls is a great idea. But there's also the sort of wholesale approach of doing the same thing, which is social media. So some of my colleagues now say if I gave a talk and it wasn't tweeted, it's like I didn't give it, right? When I sit in conferences, I feel obligated to tweet my colleagues' talks because they need this visibility. So whether it's, I know by now it's also Instagram and even platforms that go way beyond Twitter and LinkedIn, which are considered the, well-established, very, very professional, but Facebook groups are a good place. Putting your research out there as much as you have the patience to do in terms of how many platforms you agree to be on. But the visibility is not wasted. I mean, I don't hear a lot of young people saying, oh, social media is a waste of time. I think the younger generation is fully aware of the power of these platforms, but keeping people updated about what you're doing, not just what you've published, what you're thinking about tackling next, what's in the pipeline, reaching out for new collaborators from around the world. This what I call the wholesale approach to updating the world, not just individuals, I think is critically important in building your reputation. It takes effort and time, and you have to find the balance, right? You can end up losing your entire day and get swallowed by the flood of information, and you have to really manicure your Twitter and your LinkedIn to get very specific information that is relevant to you, and not let this become a distraction and a tool of procrastination, etc. All the things we know about social media. But if used well, I think it's a very not only powerful but indispensable tool for keeping the world updated about your current work and future plans. So I'll just add that at this point.
Thanks. Actually, it's interesting. I have a bit of question also for the panel on this, because I think in some ways, in terms of social media, I think it's kind of important for us to find our voice. And what I mean by that is how important is it not only to share information, but to add value to that information. Whether that be commentary on public policy or commentary on scientific insight or other types of things like that. To me, that feeds back to reputation in some way. Clearly, you need to be careful with how you do that and what you do, but I think it is an important aspect. So maybe I'll let get feedback on that in a second. The other point that I thought is really important for building these reputational networks are also beyond the kind of responses and these types of things, the types of actions that we can do, simple things like connecting two people together through an introduction, or as people have sharing reagents, or provide agreeing to read someone's grant application, or all these little things are really tangible, important things that add to that reputation, or types of the actions that I think could make a big difference. So,
Amy, just a word to follow up directly. I recently gave a talk with my colleague Tim Caulfield, who is an international expert on science communication, and he's always asked about how to make an effective use of social media, because he does research on what works. He's not just giving his impression. He has empirical projects on how to use social media effectively to fight misinformation and to promote science. And an interesting advice that he gives scientists is pick a niche. There's a lot of noise out there, but if you become known, and it's easy to become known worldwide when you're using a platform that is global. If you become known as the go-to person for a very specific narrow thing, it can be your gene, or if you're a disease person, it can be that aspect of your disease. It can be very narrow, but you are the one always tweeting, for example, about the new papers that just came out, or discussing results critically, finding media reporting on this that is badly framed and correcting it. But you are the go-to person on that niche topic. That's a huge factor in increasing your voice, finding your voice, defining it, and increasing your visibility and your impact. So just a, small advice from the expert.
I think actually just following up on that, Tim's really interesting. I mean, he's a very successful scientist, but I mean, he's written books and has confronted like superstars head on with his campaign against even as it's part of one of his books, the Goop and scientific misinformation. And I think that's really important because we all participate, I think, as scientists. We have some form of obligation to correct misinformation, and unfortunately it's so much easier, and sometimes it's much more just because of the nature of the misinformation, it's much more accepted by the public because science is inherently sort of complicated, and the language we use is convoluted and full of jargon, whereas conspiracy theory is just, and they're like watching a Netflix series. It's they're kind of something which sounds exciting. So Tim's absolutely right that it takes effort and more effort to correct that, but if we don't do it, then who is going to do it? I mean, Tim spends much of his time doing that, probably most of his time now, and he's built his reputation around that. But you don't have to do it, and you don't have to put the amount of effort that he's put in, because that's a decision he's made. And there are other good examples. Samantha Yamin was a PhD student at the University of Toronto. She decided to go into science communication, and she's got a natural gift for it. But not everybody's like that. You don't have to do it professionally, as it were. You can do it in a way which is it just fits into your own schedule. And I think what helps there is if you get wild up, instead of getting angry about something you've seen or seen written or whatever, you can respond to it. And I think we do have to be careful there because, if you're a person of color, if you're a woman, a member of the LGBT community, you are putting yourself out there with extra vulnerabilities. Peter and I don't get the sort of pushback that other people do, and so you really need to help them and to support them, and because it can be lousy. And I know a number of journalists and reporters, and it's mainly the female reporters who get just awful replies and pushback. So it's tough. So you don't have to do that. You can. It's certainly it has a downside to it. But I think Tim's idea of sticking to an area which you really do know but you also want to know more about is probably as safe as you can be, because there's nothing that disarms people and disinformation than really correct information and data. It shuts people up. They delete their tweets, they delete stuff. So that I think is one way to try to protect yourself. But I think we have to realize that it can be very intimidating for people, and it can be what can be the Wild West.
Yep, definitely. So we have a question here, and I think you guys kind of already answered it, from Daniel, who asks, how important is it to use social media such as LinkedIn and Twitter for building your research reputation? So I think you pretty much answered those questions, but perhaps to build on that question, can you think of other social media platforms where people can get engaged and share their ideas and research?
So I use Twitter and LinkedIn to share information, and I use Facebook to get information. So what I find very useful on Facebook are topical groups on specific topics, groups of experts. Some of them are closed groups. You have to apply and be assessed as an expert to become a member, but they're invaluable. They're really hive minds. If you're looking for the best paper on anything from resources for teaching to collaborators to studies that are in ongoing, and therefore there are no publications yet, and you can't find them online unless you know who's doing what. So those kinds of things that are not easily found by regular online searches, where you actually need to pick people's brains and their networks. I find Facebook is an invaluable resource, but you have to, it's all about wise choices. You don't want to be a member of too many groups. You don't want to follow too many people on Twitter. You have to really kind of keep it small, effective, and very, very relevant to what you do.
So I think, Jim, you kind of touched on an important topic or briefly about women and being involved in social media and voicing their opinions. Being that women often face many challenges in voicing their opinions. Can you think of any examples of that?
Well, I mean, it's, I'm sure you've got many more examples than I can give, but you know, it's about, usually if you're a scientist and you have some facts and figures, you know, it's like, you know, there's the cartoons about, I'll come to bed but I'm just having this argument on the internet, you know, it goes on forever. And the thing is, if you can disarm people with facts, and they will then retaliate with ad hominem attacks, right? That's all they're left with. And it can be scary. And I think, you know, I think this is what people are trying to do there, is just to find your weakness, right? And it's you know, a lot of the social media platforms, you know, can be incredibly good at conveying emotion. They can also be incredibly bad at conveying emotions. So you can actually sometimes get the wrong impression of something which is, you know, was intended to be a perfectly you know, a non-attacking sort of a comment or whatever. So I think, you know, we have to realize that, and you can just walk away. You can, at any point you can walk away. It doesn't mean you don't have to have the last word. And in fact, the people who keep coming back to the last word, they've probably lost the argument, you know, way up in the thread. So, but again, it's like, you know, what is the value? You should be getting something out. And when you're building your reputation, it's about, you know, it ultimately is about you, right? But it's how you want everybody else to feel about you. But it's got to be genuine, because, you know, it's very easy to slip up if you're not being genuine. If, you know, you lash out on somebody, that can really harm. You know, it's like, well, what is this? You know, this veneer doesn't sound real. This, you know, what level of authenticity are you expressing? If you're demonstrating support for one idea, but then, you know, you're letting something else go completely, or you comment upon something which just doesn't jive with what you've been talking about, that actually, those contrasts really stick out. So, you know, authenticity is really important. And there's a lot of things, especially on social media, you know, there are hot topics and very sensitive topics, and you don't have to jump in, right? It's coming back to, I think, Tim Caulfield's recommendation, which is to stick to what you know and help build yourself around that. But again, that doesn't mean you have to stick to science, right? We all have life experiences, and I think it's important to share that. I think you know, one aspect, you know, I would have loved to have been, if there had been a platform like Twitter when I was a graduate student, because, you know, I see professors talking with students and postdocs, and there's a complete melting pot. And, you know, I don't look up when somebody's asking me a question on, say, Twitter, to see if you're a graduate student or a professor or whatever. It's like you talk to people with no seniority in mind. And And I think that's a great way to break down the barriers. And you still see that. That's one advantage, perhaps, over there are not many, but over physical conferences and seminars and what have you, is that they can be incredibly cliquey. And I know I always advise people, if I want a student or a postdoc, if they want to go to a conference, I say, well, maybe come to this one because I'm going to be talking at it, and I can introduce you to people. But because they can be, especially the big meetings, can be incredibly cliquey. But social media breaks that down, and I think that's really important. There was a very a really good example of this, an extreme example, admittedly, was the recent a couple of weeks ago. And I'm going to get his name wrong, but a rather famous Stanford epidemiologist. I'm blanking on his name. John Ioannidis, and he's published, I don't know, 1,000 papers or something like this. And he published in a journal, which he was once an editor for, a meta-analysis of, I think it was the infection mortality rate or fatality rate. And there have been a number of studies, and they're all based on, for example, serology, right? So you need to know how many people have been infected, and then you look at the death rate and calculate. And it's a completely stupid, again, one of these single figures, which actually means nothing because they vary across cultures, countries, areas, you name it. But he in one of the appendices, he just tore a strip out of a graduate student in Australia who had done a similar study, and there's these meta studies. It depends on what you include or don't include in terms of the studies. But he basically called him out and said, he doesn't even have a PhD yet, blah 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 blah, and it was remarkable. So here you have this really, really famous, supposedly this huge reputation, this guy at Stanford, and he was correctly called out by people all over Twitter for doing this and publishing this ad hominem attack on a graduate student. And it turns out, of course, this graduate student has a master's in public health, which is the normal career path for an epidemiologist. He's doing his PhD, he's published papers, and it was entirely uncalled for. And I thought that, that was a great example of one person in the old world, as it were, using their privilege and their fame and deserved reputation and almost throwing it away. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people just have, he's destroyed his reputation over that. So I think that's kind of cool, because in a way, it wasn't cool that what he did to this student in Australia. But it just shows that that sort of level of hierarchy is, there's not much place for it, to be honest. And although this was somewhat, it was very disturbing to see, in another way, it's probably good to see that sort of, what this guy had done was made public. And otherwise, it's that's a trait which people wouldn't have known about. And of course, there are other people came to his defense. So I think that's why, you don't punch down, you never punch down. And it also is a good example of, how it doesn't matter how good your reputation is, you can destroy it just like that.
So Jim, I have the exact same example from the pre-social media, pre-COVID world with a very senior scholar in my field who at a conference in front of hundreds of people tore into a graduate student who just presented with questions that instead of being constructive criticism were really meant to humiliate. But hundreds of colleagues, we're not a big field. The people who matter were there, and they never forgot. And this very senior person who published books and held big grants afterwards for several years was disinvited when it came to smaller workshops where papers were written together or other panels such as this. People remembered and they made a point of not inviting that person because of that attitude. So what you said about punching down, beyond being the basic, human decency and just being respectful of people because they're people, using your status to, rather than to empower others and build their confidence and ask them questions. Maybe they did say something wrong, but there are so many ways of tackling that. So rather than being constructive and building, putting people down to make yourself look good is the worst thing you can do for your own reputation. It will come back to bite you long-term and short-term. As an ethicist, I should say it's just unethical, but we're talking here about reputation, and it's really one of the most important pieces of advice that we can give.
Yeah, I think one other thing to think about, and to building on these earlier comments about kind of the PC versus post-C world, pre-COVID versus post-COVID world, the increased awareness of science in our communities, in the press, and everywhere, changes this equation a little bit also, because suddenly, instead of the examples that we just heard, which are largely within academic communities and certainly represent your an important part of your reputation, suddenly people are exposed really to the general public and a much broader perspective of perspectives with respect to, I don't know, everything from, should you be vaccinated to everything else. So I think thinking about how that access and interest in science both can be something to be careful about, but also something to represent an opportunity as a responsibility from our position, I think is really important.
I should mention, again, for students and postdocs who may not have experienced this yet, but if you go on to, and get an academic position, you submit a grant application, it's amazing around the table how people will have some idea of the type of scientist you are. And usually, the first grant application, second grant application, that's okay, because it doesn't, you're young, you're starting out. But after a while, I think it's, it's worth 3 or 4, well, 3 not points, but decimal points on a score. If somebody really is seen to be not collaborative, is not supportive, doesn't put their students and postdoctoral fellows first, for example, if there are bad experiences there, it adds up. And I think it's probably less important at the level of, when you're submitting a paper, because the reviewers are from around the world. But the scientific community is really small. The stem cell community in Canada is probably 1,000 people, or maybe 2,000, something like that. So it all comes back. So it's not something which it can be easily erased. It's like these people who've been caught doing bad things, trying to erase the Google citations to it, and they pay thousands of dollars, and it comes back, within a few hours. Your reputation really is not something which is it tends to stick, put it that way.
Yes. So I'm also on Twitter, but not as prolific as probably Jim or Vardit or Peter, all of you. And I'm still learning my ropes on how to tweet online. It's not as easy as I had imagined. So thank you for all your advice. I'm also not as prolific, I think, partly because I'm a little shy, a little bit of an introvert, and I'm always worried about what to say, and partly also coming from sick kids, I am representing sick kids, so I have to watch what I say, I think, online. And so that also means not just tweeting what I say online, but getting involved with news media, for example. It's one thing that we're not allowed to talk directly to news media coming from sick kids. So do you have any advice on how to engage with media communication to get more visibility, for example?
I'll jump in because that's my favorite topic. And it is my favorite topic because my own research touches on sort of political hot potatoes, such as what technologies the government should fund and for whom, or the rollout of new screening tests. So like a lot of what I do is contentious. And right now I work on vaccine certificates and triage protocols, things that journalists want to talk about all the time. I always say as a bioethicist that I feel it's a part of my professional responsibility to talk to the media. But as Jim said, it's not for everybody. Some people just struggle with the sound bites, right? Giving the elevator pitch, giving the 3-second and 3-minute and 7-minute versions of the impact of the work. Some people do work that is not at that stage of the pipeline and it's just more basic sciencey and it's not relevant yet for knowledge transfer or for policy making. But if the kind of work you do has potential for that kind of impact, and it doesn't have to be, the government is making a decision about a public health measure and you can chip in it because you're a public health expert. It can be purely educating the public about stem cells, about genomics, about, just increasing scientific literacy by translating in an accessible, intriguing, attractive way, a piece of science, a tiny piece of the pie. That's extremely valuable. So I wouldn't call it a responsibility or an obligation, but I would encourage anyone working in a field that is relevant to knowledge translation to dip a toe into the water and see if it's for them. Some people really love that kind of engagement. It's very, very different than giving a talk, right? You have much less control. You can't really prepare as much. You have to think on your feet. You have to pivot. You have to come with your speaking points and sort of ignore the journalists a little bit in order to shove what you came to say, no matter what. It requires a lot of skills that are much more on your feet, spontaneous, conversational than getting onto the podium and giving a talk that you prepared for such a long time that is so meticulously orchestrated. So I think it's a great experience if you feel like kind of stretching yourself and experimenting with other parts of your personality and your kind of capacity to communicate. That's all in terms of sort of the riskier part of it. In terms of visibility, being the kind of scientist that is on, I call it on journalist speed dial for, when a story breaks or when they need information on a specific scientific topic, if you're the go-to person, that's huge visibility. That gets your name out there way beyond your community, which is typically small, and is really a worthwhile effort in terms of building your reputation. This will mean that people who are maybe on the margins of your own scientific community will end up reaching to you for cross-disciplinary collaborations because you're just known. So, I could talk about this for hours. I personally love engaging with the media, and I just started hosting a podcast series, which is, it blows my mind how much fun it is when you have 30 minutes to talk about something and not 3 minutes. But, as I said, a part of it is personality. Do you like that kind of exchange or not? So I just encourage people to give it a shot.
Yeah, maybe the only thing I'll add to that is I think the skill and discipline of communicating your science with clarity to a broad, public audience can't be underestimated, even for scientists, talking to scientists and writing grants. I mean, this is really where, people who are able to do that are often, successful in communicating what they're doing, and that leads to all kinds of, reputational and award success as well. So it's a good exercise for sure.
Yeah, I'd add to it is really important. I mean, I've said this to other people before. When you're submitting a grant application in particular, And it's the same with a fellowship application, a postdoctoral fellowship or a graduate student fellowship, studentship. You think you're being adjudicated by your peers, and you are, but they're not experts in exactly what you do. So they're experts in the overall field, but you know more about what you're talking about than they do, just because that's your life. And you need to be able to break down and express yourself and get across your ideas in an approachable manner, because the worst thing, when no reviewer gets to just review one grant application or fellowship application, we had a stack of 10. And we know that there's a couple of them are going to get funded. So you really want to make sure that reviewer is not having to fight to understand every word that you're writing or to understand your meaning, because they're not going to do that. They don't have the patience, and other people have done it, have done that, and that they made it a much less steep slope to understand what they're trying to address. So as Peter mentioned, and I think Twitter in particular is important in this, because it makes you think about every word. You've got to be succinct. I know I had a grant application to CIHR, and it was, every section was character limited. And I think my experience on Twitter helped enormously in trying to condense what I wanted to say. And that was in the days of 140 characters. Now it's 280 characters. You can blather about anything almost. But it's like the saying that it's I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I'm writing a long one. And it is, you're putting together your words in a meaningful manner, which is open to which allows people to enter your mind, is a really important skill. And the most important element to that is not when you're talking to somebody who already knows what you're talking about. It's when trying to educate them as you're going along. And believe me, you need to educate reviewers like me, because nobody knows as much as you do. I'd add, so Amy mentioned, being careful about what she tweets, because she's representing an institution in sick kids. And I think that's absolutely is true when you're talking to, if you're going to be talking to a journalist or a media outlet, there are strict policies, and that's because universities and hospitals have reputations to manage themselves, and it's very easy. And I've done it. You can just say something out of line, not intended. But at the same time, I don't think you have to stick to everything that you're doing professionally, right? Because you've got opinions and you've got experience and you've got perspectives as a scientist, which and you're a member of society. Nobody's asking you to put aside your humanity to be just as a scientist. And in fact, I think that's a mistake, because sometimes science and politics don't necessarily mix very well. And everybody says, oh, again, during the pandemic, if only this country was run by scientists. I think that would be pretty disastrous, because we experiment, we do things in ways which are not necessarily thinking about the overall impact. We have that luxury of being able to control our environment, and politicians don't have that. Politicians are looking, obviously they're looking for votes and whatever else and popularity, but they're making decisions weighing lots of different things together, which some of us just don't appreciate, because we don't have that experience. So I think it's perfectly fine to talk about politics, to talk about books you're reading, whatever. I think that's good. In fact, it's enjoyable, and it adds more to, it allows people to learn more about you, because otherwise you're just the face of a scientist, and they've got a lot more depth than that. And the other thing is that, on the scientific side, I really enjoy reading the authors of, they put up a preprint on bioRxiv, and they do a little tutorial on it. And it's, again, coming from them. It summarizes the the work in 6 or 7 or 8 tweets, and it's really addressable. It takes like 3 minutes to read it, and it's like, yeah, I really want to go and read that that preprint or not. But the ones which are really good, and most of them are pretty good, I think it's a great way. And not only that, it's a great way for others to amplify that message, right? Because typically, if you're a student or a postdoc, you don't necessarily have, you've got to build your scientific reputation. Not a lot of other scientists necessarily will follow you, but things escalate and get amplified. And again, it's like, you can help people. You can help your graduate student and postdoc colleagues when you see, because it's really exciting. It's such a big event to submit a preprint or publish a paper. It's a huge amount of work, and they deserve that limelight. And it's like, it's what's his name? Marshall, everybody's famous for 15 minutes. You're famous for a tweet at least. And so that's good. It's a big equalizer and a great way to get your message out.
Amy, I just wanted to follow up on Jim's point that all those skills that you need for good social media and good media are totally then transferable back into your scientific work. I know this panel is not about how to write a good grant. It's about building your reputation. But I just want to tell you a quick story that makes this point. Genome Canada's large-scale grants are millions, and so they do the final review for the grant is in person. Your team comes before an international panel of experts, and you have to defend your grant. So I was on my way to Toronto for one of those reviews. I was obviously very nervous, and I jumped into an Uber, and turned out my Uber driver was a graduate student. Asked me why I'm going to Toronto, Uber small talk, and I said, well, it's a review of a grant. He said, tell me about the grant. And I spent the few minutes on the way to the airport telling the story. It had to be accessible. It had to be brief because we were getting to the airport. And it had to demonstrate what difference will it make if we get this money? Like, what will it do? What's the bottom line? Who's going to benefit and how? And it was an amazing exercise that, I got it to Toronto, I got to the review, and I actually used the framing that I did in the Uber. And I'm not saying that was the only reason we got the grant, but we did. And we've been doing amazing work since. And then 6 months later, I'm going to the airport again, and I get into an Uber, and it's the same guy. And he turns around and goes, so did you get the grant? And I said, yeah, and you had a part to play in it. So the point is, of course, that this whole thing about elevator pitches and call your grandmother and explain to her what your grant is about, that actually works. Like, try to experiment, do a pretend media interview, do a pretend conversation with your grandma or whoever, your dog. And this actually develops in you these skills. Jim described it in terms of characters, but my point is, it's also our human nature as storytellers. So if you're a lab scientist and you're tweaking, maybe it's not easy to tell a story about that, but you can always take it a step further and explain, if you're successful, what impact could this have on science, on medicine, on Canadians, on, so to somehow try to tell a story with everything, with every tweet, with every grant that you write, I think is hugely impactful. And, indirectly building your reputation. But I just had to jump onto Jim's point that these skills are not just for the public, they're for your peers as well.
So, what I'm hearing is that communicating your science to your peers is important. Communicating through social media platforms is important. One of the things I wanted to touch on is communicating to the non-academic community, but more specifically to foundations and patient advocacy groups, the importance of that, and whether we should be playing an active role in communicating to that particular target. And the reason why I say this is because one of the things, and I'll give you my example. So I work on cystic fibrosis, and we all know in the cystic fibrosis world that there's a miracle drug called Trikafta that seems to work very well and is supposed to cure CF patients with the main mutation, but it's not available in Canada. And it's trying to fight the government to make it accessible for Canadian CF patients has been very difficult. And I see, I follow CF Canada all the time, and I see patients responding and asking for @JT to please approve. And I don't know if I should be getting involved in that kind of dialogue with that particular group. So what are your thoughts on that?
Peter should answer this, but I think what you're presenting is it's a really interesting scenario, which is very real. And I've seen it with cancer patients, and other areas where, but this is why what I was talking about before, whereas we're scientists, we're people, we live in a society, we know people who have various diseases, and I think you do have a role to advocate. The problem is that this can be life and death for people, and as a consequence, the level of passion is almost at the level of desperation, and I completely understand it, but it can also be tricky. It can be difficult. It's true in the stem cell field, right, where we see all of these and largely hokey promises of cures for various terminal diseases, and those people, if you tell them no, that's complete garbage, you're wasting your money, you got to be careful. That's their last hope, and you are trying to save them from wasting their money, but at the same time, so it works both ways. So things like drug pricing, the ethics of who should get what sort of drugs, or vaccines even, it's thin ice. You have to be very, very careful, but you can provide the reassurance that this is scientifically plausible. This makes sense. I wish that the cost was less, whatever. But be aware that they're usually single issue, and there's no way, they're just looking for one type of support. And you can be not abused, but you can be mischaracterized. You can say that, oh, Dr. Wong at Sick Kids, who is an expert in this area, says, you can be misrepresented. So I think, but at the same time, it's so important because of your knowledge to have an opinion, because you for sure have an opinion on this, right? And it's very difficult. And I think in the field of regenerative medicine, this is a very important topic.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what I was going to say, I think aligns very well with what Jim just said, which is that you bring an expertise and a science base to the question that I think is important, and there's two aspects to it. One is the social, political, economic side of things, but then there's the actual science side, which is why is this drug so effective? What is the biology behind it? What is the support for that? Those kind of things, I think, are largely facts based on your expertise that you can support and provide information on, and then you can separate that from your opinion about how society might move forward to handle the challenges from that. But I think there's two different aspects there, and in the stem cell field, we've handled this for years, including society trying to tackle information for patients, how to differentiate between snake oil type stuff versus stem cell related therapies or derived therapies that might be really important for people to have access to. At the end of the day, though, if there's a drug that could really change the outcome of people's lives, we do have a responsibility to somewhere along the way say, this is the way this works, and this is an exciting opportunity. I personally feel, and this is maybe, again, this gets into a little bit of a gray area, but and it's different it was a different decision for me, maybe for you, and I would totally understand that. But I personally feel there's certainly, as your reputation grows, responsibility comes with that reputation, and part of that responsibility is to try to use that reputation in a way that that benefits others.
Peter, I love this framing of using your reputation as a resource, and if it can actually help real people, then that's an amazing way of using it. And Amy, to your question, it depends so much on context. So I'm thinking of my colleague Jacques Tremblay, who does gene editing for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and he works with patient advocacy groups. He works with them to recruit. He works with them to design studies from the beginning in a way that addresses their needs, and even for fundraising. So that's one model where you're totally embedded within the community, or Mito Canada, which is a patient organization that works with scientists to advance research on mitochondrial disease. So in some disease communities, the link is, it's like integrated almost. And researchers find themselves embedded within these communities for study design, for recruitment, and even for funding. And in others, the distance that you described, maybe when, again, if you're doing more basic science and less, not as close to the clinical trials, you need to keep that distance. But the answer to your question totally depends on the disease you're researching and the type of relationship that you can, I don't know, responsibly have with patients. But I just wanted to point out that there are other models where the relationship is very, very close.
So I just want to circle back a little bit. Thank you all for that. Circle back a little bit about building your reputation. And, we talked quite a lot about online presence and media platforms. Perhaps we can go back and circle back to talk about the more traditional ways of building your reputation. And I know we touched a little bit about, networking and meeting people at conferences. Certainly in the pre-COVID era, that was possible. But in the post-COVID era, how does one go about doing that, especially when everything is online? You can't go and have coffee chats with Dr. X and be like, hey, do you want to work together? And establish that kind of mentorship or collaboration where eventually it helps build your reputation. So what advice can you give to ECIs in terms of building that network?
Well, I think one thing you can do, or many things you can do, is to, actually put yourself out there. In other words, try to make connections. I'm sure different research institutes and university departments are dealing with in different ways, but our research training center really, over the past year especially, as everything has gone virtual, has invited people to give, of course, virtual either interviews or talks about their experience, their career experiences, with the express reasoning to actually connect them to our current trainees. And it means it's easy. People they all accept because it's it's an hour online basically, but it makes connections. It helps to restore those connections, and there's lots of anecdotes which are shared. So participating in those sorts of things, and also offering to coming up with ideas in student groups or student bodies or postdocs or whatever. One thing we've missed, and we've had to cancel it 3 times now, is we have an annual retreat, which is the main benefit of the retreat, and I'm sure it's the case in Montreal and in Vancouver. Our departmental retreat was the social aspect. We used to have 75 posters, and you could just find out what people were doing. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to do that in a virtual context. So you've got to look for differences, and you can't just replace it by saying, oh, we're going to have a coffee time where people can just chat and get together, because they don't do it spontaneously. But you can reach out in small groups, and I don't know, it's kind of late now, after a year, but I think there's been probably a huge variance in the degree to which various labs have engaged their lab members, especially those who have not been able to get together in their institute or department, in part because people have different ways of doing things. And I've seen that some whether it's through Slack or through there's the ones which have been successful are the ones which have actually mixed the science with the social aspects, because you do care about what other people are doing in the lab, what the family background is, and etc. All those sorts of things. That's how we enrich ourselves in terms of experience. And so those groups, I think, have done pretty well, because they've actually gotten closer, but also they've been helping each other, right? Because it's like with any network, the more nodes you have in the network, the more the more connections you're going to be able to make. So it's like those horrible signal transduction, protein interaction globs, hairballs. But that's actually how it works, right? So it's almost like a snowball coming down a hill. You do pick up more as you get bigger. So I think that's where tapping into others, talking to others, how are they dealing with it? Going online. There was an Ontario Institute for Cancer Research symposium last week. It ran from, I think it was 9 in the morning till about 1 on 2 days. There was poster sessions. I was there virtually. I thought it was well handled, but it was different. And so some things are good, some things work well, some things don't work well. So I think you have to realize everybody's experimenting, but they're experimenting because they realize the importance of networking to people. And there aren't going to be perfect solutions which are going to help everybody, but really it does mean that you need to experiment as well.
One of the things that's emerged over the last little while that is on the really positive side are these international specialized scientific networks. So, I'm aware of one. I'm just actually writing a letter for someone, for example, in an area of muscle, now all the world experts in muscle stem cells get together, and they, it doesn't matter if they're in Italy or in wherever, and they have a meeting. There's another one that members of my lab are involved in around synthetic embryos or other things. So these groups could not have been possible before they were kind of forced in this scenario because of COVID, but actually are great scientific exchanges and ways to build reputation, to share data, to show leadership and ideas, and people are starting these groups, people are managing these groups, and I think there's a lot of merit in some of that exchange.
I see Vardit just popped something in her mouth. So she can't speak right now, but so I'm going to help you out. One thing just to say for Peter, if you read a paper, there's nothing to stop you, which you're interested in, and the subject you're interested in, nothing to stop you reaching out to one of the authors. And because when you publish a paper yourself, there's nothing better than somebody asking you about your research, getting an email saying, and it may be that you're asking for reagents or you're asking for advice, but that's another way, because you've got a connection, you've made a connection, you've said, I'm interested in what you're doing. And that is, it doesn't matter where they are in the world, and you can build up friendships in that way, and you can certainly help restore some level of interactivity. Whether it goes anywhere, who knows? But there's really nothing to lose.
So now that I finished my chocolate, Jim and Peter, I see such a huge difference between pre-COVID relationships that started as real life relationship and are now maintained online versus people that you met in the past year, and your entire history is online. And I think it's very telling. I think we will have to go back to some degree of conferencing and getting in, ourselves into the same room as others, because once you've established that, then you can, the online can feed off of that for a while. But without that preliminary connection, it's been really tough. So things that I've been doing are, for example, colleagues that I usually meet at least once a year in conferences, and now I don't. We schedule a Zoom coffee or a Zoom drinks. I know it's really tedious. You're the whole day on Zoom. The last thing you want to do at night is chat with somebody on Zoom, but we do try to do that, or in small groups. 4 researchers working on the same topic. We just hang out. We're not meeting to discuss the research. We meet to hang out, and we ended up coming up with an idea for a grant, even though that was not the goal. So that can work. I've also been inviting colleagues to give guest lectures in my courses. So if you're teaching, it reduces the burden on you a little bit. It's fun for, as you said, Jim, it's just, nobody has to travel to your city to do it. They just have to sit wherever they are and dedicate maybe an hour. But it brings you up to speed on what they're doing because they're telling that to your students. It's fun for the students because it's diversity, and it's just, putting you back in touch. Giving talks everywhere. Again, we were saving all the travel time and all the expense and all the environmental impact. So there's been much more engagement of international colleagues in every event that we put together. So I'm trying to focus on the positive, but nothing will replace at least the baseline relationships. And I hope we can get back to it as soon as possible.
So I spoke with some of my colleagues, and one of the things they said was you can really leverage the mentors that you have in your research institute to try to introduce you to new collaborators or new peers or etc. But for some of my peers, where they come from smaller research institute, that's not as easily accessible. So do you have any advice for those people in terms of getting more visibility? Getting to know people outside of their realm?
So Jim already said multiple times that social media breaks down these barriers. Nobody knows well, maybe they do if they check, but which institution you're from and how prestigious it is and how much research it does. If what you put out there is interesting and valuable, then it stands for itself. And the other thing is that being proactive, and again, it's time and energy, and sometimes we're just overworked, but reaching out to people proactively, as Jim said about a paper they just published, or asking them what they're up to recently that you don't know about, that's very helpful.
Great. So I think the last topic I kind of want to talk on, and I think it's quite important, especially given this day and age, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, and there's a lot of, I would say, and maybe you agree or disagree with me, there's a lot of scientific mistrust or mistrust in science. And I wonder if it is now our time to, or as a scientist, to play a more active role in communicating the science to not just our peers, but to the general public, and try to gain that trust back from the community.
Yeah, I don't think it's a lack of trust. I think we hear this all the time, right? There's this, and there are books about it, and this rejection of expertise. I think it's just, that's people being frustrated. They're frustrated because they don't necessarily see an end to it, or they see an end, which has been promised and then it's been passed, and so there's a lot of frustration. However, I do think it is an opportunity to say that there's a lot of things that science can't do, but there are some things which it can do, and those are to objectively evaluate the world around us to try to find solutions which are not, not necessarily biased by our own human frailties. And ultimately, that's, we have lots of examples, especially through the last year, of that, where we saw the debacles over hydroxychloroquine and bleach or whatever, and even experts changing their minds. So in terms of, whether masks were useful or not useful. And that's what science is about. So, the recovery trial in the UK was really remarkable. I think it was just like, to me, this was an experience of, yeah, we don't really know what the answer is. We're going to put it into this machine, and 2 months later, out comes this result. And the data was just startling. For the good, things like dexamethasone, and for the bad, hydroxychloroquine, etc. So, if we get organized, we can use science in that sort of way. The problem is, we have, and it's increased over time, is we've overpromised what science can do. So we talk about cures, and we talk about, things, science that is in language like groundbreaking and transformative research and what have you. And in the end, that's not, we aren't the people to judge that. That's going to be, history judges that. So we have to be very careful not to overpromise, but really to, despite all the temptations and despite journalists wanting you to overstate what you're seeing, because they've got to sell their byline to the newspaper, they're competing with their own peers. We have to be tempted not to do that, but to explain exactly what it's doing and what it's not, what it shows and what it doesn't show. And I think actually people appreciate that. They get more distrustful if you make a, you say make a prediction and it just doesn't come true, right? I mean, it's like, Peter was head of executive director of Medicine by Design. I'm sure 7 years ago, whatever, when that grant application went into the CFREF, there were some things, milestones and promises which were made, which, fortunately were evaluated scientifically, but some of them would have come true, some of them, were realized, and some weren't, and that's science. But we've got to be much more careful in public as to, like when we speak to newspapers or even on social media, about what we're saying, and not to be, not to be too dogmatic, and certainly not to be, overly optimistic, because life, science actually has a way of confounding us with disappointing results and details which we hadn't thought about.
So the phenomenon that Jim just referred to, Tim Caulfield calls the hype, or hyping the science, and he always cautions about that. So I think if we think about stem cells, and the sort of ebbs and flow, the excitement about a new technology, and then realizing that it's actually going to take longer than we thought, and then discovering the disappointing results, and this process often occurs away from the public eye. So other than these clinics, stem cell clinics that popped up around the world where desperate people go, as Jim said, unless you're suffering from that kind of disease and you're at the end of the road, you're not really exposed in your daily life to the fact that the science is evolving and that we're not just changing our minds, the evidence emerges and it becomes more robust, and then it's refuted, etc. So what we consider to be the scientific process mostly occurs sort of behind closed doors, and then when it gets to a certain level of robustness, or being established and rolled out, then it's introduced to the public. And I think what COVID did is it exposed us because evidence had to be rolled out in real time about things that were not studied before, and they had immediate impact on public policy and on measures that had an impact on each and every member of society, not on disease communities, not on. And so I almost felt some days that everybody sees how the sausage is made and it's too complicated for them. So instead of thinking, whoa, my government is awesome because it actually pivots with the evidence, people say my decision makers are capricious and clueless because they keep changing their mind. They should be changing their mind, and you should be understanding that that's how science always works, but that's really complicated to communicate. So we've been talking about this a lot, especially those of us in public health who have been communicating with the media daily to sort of explain why the government is changing its position all the time and to maintain that trust. And we all came to the same conclusion that transparency is the only thing that works. If you try to hide the process in order to make it simpler or less, multidimensional or less evolving, you're going to lose. So yes, it's complicated. And sometimes you have to expose the fact that we thought something was established and we were wrong. But transparency is the only way to go. And that goes back to reputation, because that's not just the reputation of the scientific enterprise in the public eye and in front of political decision makers. It's also your own reputation as an individual scientist that you have to expose. Papers are retracted. Results are not being replicated. Sometimes, and I'm not talking about fraud, right? I'm just talking about what the normal progress is, that it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So I think COVID has been a real teachable moment for the science community, the policy community, and the public. And it exacerbated so many things that took them to the extreme. So those of us who believe that science will bring the solutions, cheered the vaccines and said, well, it was the fast development was done on the shoulders of all the RNA research that we've been doing. We wouldn't have been able to roll it out so fast if we didn't have the basis. Yay, science is now saving the planet. And then the other part of the public that had the anti-vax mistrust to begin with now believes that, if there is a virus at all, it was created in a lab by vicious scientists who have some economic agenda. So it's just been a year of exacerbating so many things, and it will take us some time to come to terms with what we've learned. But to me, the lesson that emerged is all about transparency.
So I have a question here from the audience through the chat function, but I would just want to remind the attendees that if you do have a question, please put into the Q&A, and I'll be sure to ask your questions. So this question asks, how does one repair, say you unfortunately you're established or you're known to have a bad reputation, how does one repair your bad reputation?
You start at day one. You start and build afresh by doing good deeds. And I think as mea culpas are really important. If you made a mistake, you admit it. We're not all perfect. People can take the wrong, get the wrong impression. But I think that's why when you're evaluating somebody, it's just like in life. We're all complicated, multifaceted blobs of organic material, and you shouldn't take just a single comment that somebody's made. It's a little bit different. When I gave the example of Ioannidis, that was so grotesque actually, and so formulated. It was a published manuscript. That's a little different. There was a lot of intent there for sure. It wasn't an off-the-cuff mistake, but typically there's always new people to meet, but you can also repair reputations, and you see this in society because we forgive and forget all the time, and Vardit knows this. When you're talking to policymakers. Because we change policies and we change them for reasons because something didn't work. And if we held everybody, if we had this sort of perfect memory and held everybody accountable to everything they did, we'd never have a surviving politician for more than one term, because that's the way it is. They they make decisions, and some of them are right and some of them are wrong. And but again, so Peter mentioned about responsibility, and I think that's, you know, that's what's really important. If you act, sometimes, you know, you need a little voice inside you to say, you know, is what I'm doing going to improve things or make things worse? And if it's going to make things worse, or it's not contributing, then don't press send, sort of thing. And you know, and I'm guilty of pressing send too many times, but at the same time, I think, you know, you don't want that voice of inhibition to be too loud, but it should be there, because it is very easy to damage not just reputations, but friendships and you know, things which are going to take a lot of time to rebuild.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talked about the panel talked about this at their pre-meeting, and I thought about it a little bit afterwards. I think, you know, obviously there's many different types of damaging to reputations, but you know, taking into context that people make mistakes or learn from things, I think there is a responsibility for our community also to have empathy and to participate in the process of you know, helping people to learn and participate in the discourse in a positive way. And you know, we've all tweeted things. Personally, I can say I've tweeted things that I wish I hadn't, or learned even more so, learned after the fact that what I did might have either hurt someone or been damaging without being aware of it. And there's an awareness to that that I think is part of the process. So, you know, maybe that's another helpful perspective.
Yeah, what they said.
Fantastic. So we're coming up onto the last 20 minutes, and I thought I'd just open it up to all of you in terms of what else do you think we're missing, in terms of how else can we build our reputation, and you feel that we as early career investigators could really learn and benefit from your insight.
Maybe you can say something, which is, you know, the more conscious you are of trying to build your reputation, the less effective it will be. Those actions will be. You know, a lot of this isn't necessarily something which you can do. You shouldn't be doing things just for your reputation. It should be because you want to do them. Because again, it's coming back to something I said before about, you know, you've got to be authentic. And if you're counting things, you're counting every little micro action that you take, it's not only would it be exhausting, but as Peter just said, sometimes you don't know the effect that something you're doing is going to have on somebody. It could have a negative effect. So I think, you know, we have to be a little bit careful about being too mechanistic or intentional around this. There are a lot of people who I'm sure do not think a thing about their reputation. They've got phenomenal reputations because they're just wonderful people. And that's great, right? That's the ideal. So you can nurture, you can sculpt, you can try to, you know, repair mistakes which have been made, try to explain some of your opinions which were perhaps misunderstood or misrepresented. But you don't have to be so conscious about it in terms of, sorry, no, not conscious, deliberate about it. I think you have to be conscious, right? At least of the stuff that you're saying and writing, because we do have that responsibility. But if you're too, you know, if you really are too artificial and thinking that everything I do, you know, it's like I've got an overall plan here, then I think you're going to be both exhausted and probably disappointed, because other people will imbue a reputation on you, and that's going to be derived from their perspective of you, and you do not control that.
Jim is so wise. I just love the way you frame
I'm
it.
old.
You know, sometimes there's correlation, but not necessarily causation. No, but I really love the way you framed it about just authentically being a good person and not being calculated. And I have to say, when I step back from this panel for a second, I love how we spend very little time talking about the scientific side of, oh, you should publish here and there, and you should build your grants. Like we hardly talked about building reputation from a scientific perspective, and we spent so much time talking about personality, ethics, integrity, being respectful, being collaborative, being accountable, acknowledging your mistakes, really sort of basic moral character and being a decent human being. And I love that, you know, when we were asked, what should you do to build your reputation, we went that way, because the other stuff, I mean, maybe it's just too obvious that, you know, you should be a good researcher and not commit fraud and respect the principles of research ethics and get consent from your participants. Of course, that's not why we gathered here today, but still we spent so much of our time talking about the human side of being a scientist and being an expert, which I loved. I have one little sort of idea that I started doing mostly now that the world is virtual, and that's mentorship as a volunteer activity. So we all mentor our students, or, you know, whether you have a lab or a research group like me, we do tons of mentorship as a part of our job. But there are people in low resource environments, whether other countries or smaller, you know, further away institutions, that don't have access to mentorship. And if you kind of let people know that you're open to that, I think of this as volunteer, right? I don't go to the hospital to serve meals. I want to do something with my time that is sort of a little outside of what I consider to be my paid job, and that's what I do. So I picked about 5 people from various countries who are very early in their careers, and there's always somebody who's more junior than you, right? And I mentor them virtually on a regular basis. And it's been, as Jim said, it's not that I'm doing it to build a reputation. I'm doing it because I was just looking to do something useful during COVID for people who are struggling more than me. But I think it's just very indirectly also expanded my networks to parts of the world that, you know, it's been just a wonderful experience, and I highly recommend it. So it's actually not an answer about how to build your reputation, but how to be a good person as a scientist, as a scholar, and it can have marginal reputational effects.
That's a great great point, and great thought to one way to use time and have an impact. I mean, one thing, you know, it'd be interesting to hear from the audience. I think the things that you're worried about and the ways that you use social media and build your reputation, I think are very changed along your career. You know, when you're a grad student, when you're an early faculty member, when you're you know, a full professor, when you're leading a research institute, you're thinking and using it in different ways. And I think it's important to think about a little bit, maybe not that trajectory, because that sounds too kind of preformed, but really how within the context of your environment and your ecosystem, how you can share both your experience but also your goals and your ambitions around that. I think is a perspective that's kind of important. You know, obviously, everyone wants scientists to be successful in both their their science and the impact of that science on society, whether it's helping people understand how science works or what the science that you're doing actually does. And so thinking about that as in the context of the stage of your career, I think is one perspective that could be quite helpful.
So just want to add one thing to that, because what Peter mentions is really important there. There are a lot of really, really good scientists, and some scientists see a trajectory for themselves. They've got a vision. They want to just continue working in their lab, be an expert in their field, make contributions. Others, want to have ambitions for leadership. And the reason that Peter is a leader at UBC is because it's not just because of his science. Because as I say, there's a lot of people doing fantastic science. It's because of his reputation that he built up, being willing to work with others, to coordinate teams, to get people to work together. Those assets or those qualities are on top of the research, right? And that not everybody wants to do that. That's fine. But if you do, you really do need to show some evidence, give other people rationale. You don't just want to be applying for a leadership position with a where you've not demonstrated any initiative and willingness to to lead like a group grant application, that sort of thing, because it's a lot harder work to do that, as we all know, than just to write a single grant or a single fellowship. So that's where again it's I think we have to realize that reputation, ultimately you're the person who benefits from it, and it's something we all want a good reputation, but you have to put work into it, which is not necessarily unidimensional in terms of just the work you're doing. What you have to you need to build a reputation as to what qualities and abilities that you have that other people can then see from your actions and your words. So that's why I think it's whether or not there aren't many leaders. It's a pretty tight pyramid, but no matter what area of work, in the public sector, private sector, it doesn't matter. Those are what the management is looking for. They're looking for your other characteristics, what your initiative is like, not just to be how you execute your job, your 9 to 5 or 8 to 10 p.m. job or whatever it is. They're looking for that roundedness, and they can't give that to you. You have to demonstrate it.
In the last 10 minutes, I'm getting a lot of questions, and so perhaps we can make the answers a little bit brief to answer all the questions. Nika asks, what are the strategies we can use to get a measure of our reputation and how we are perceived by the scientific and broader community? And are there good and bad signs we should look out for outside of citations, etc.?
One measure is, think of the part of your CV that is called your expertise, like the acknowledgement of your expertise. Are you invited to be a reviewer of grants, in my field of books, obviously of papers? What caliber of journals invite you to be a reviewer? That's kind of measurable. But how many people reach out to you for advice, for collaborations, for help? It would be more who comes to you rather than what you do. That would be how I'd measure.
Yeah, the idea of a reputation index, if one is constructed, it's gonna be totally irrelevant. But just as Vardit said, it's basically you get a sense, but I think, you know, when you do get invitations or somebody's asked me, said that you're really good at doing this, that's where you get a sense that you're on the right track. And but it's difficult. You're not necessarily going to know. You kind of have to. Usually, hopefully, other people will come to you and say, "Wow, you know, that was really helpful," right? So you get some feedback, but it's not something you can count on.
We have a question here from through the chat function. What about some more formal steps to get better at building your reputation? Media training, speaker training, how to network, any tips?
So some universities actually offer these. There used to be in-person workshops, now they're all virtual, but media training is offered more and more. How to write a good grant is offered more and more. If you feel you can improve your skills and you have the patience, these can be really good. And back to Jim's great point about how media training will actually help you write better grants and give better talks. There's a nice little book about how they train TED speakers, how to give a TED talk. It's a fun short read, and it can really, I mean, there's so many resources out there about how to improve your public speaking and build your talks in a more accessible way. There's lots out there. If you're looking for these resources, you'll find them everywhere.
Yeah, I was maybe going to just add to that. I think there's two aspects to that. There's the kind of, let's call it the technical, the skills, the communication skills, the clarity, the use of language, that all that is super important, and that's something you can learn to do better always. And then there's the other side, which is really what we talked about earlier, that Vardit said so nicely, which is, you know, at the end of the day, you want to be doing the right actions, supporting people, supporting collaborations, and that's something that you want to give yourself an opportunity to do within your career, because that really leads to this broader network that makes science so much fun. First of all, I mean, at the end of the day, but also I think helps us to do better science overall too.
Just the last point on there, going back to what Tim Caulfield, or Vardit said about Tim Caulfield, you know, fortunately, the internet means you can blog about anything. It goes out to the world. If you're going to do that, don't worry about the audience, because there won't be any audience initially, but you can snowball. If you are writing something which other people which is good quality and is different from a perspective other people are writing about, it doesn't have to be every week. You know, it just has to be good quality. Then you will build up some level of interaction, and you cross advertise that, right, via Twitter. You can everything's can be linked together online. So that's easy to do, but don't expect immediate results. It's just something which will take time to establish.
I have one final question here from Gonas. Just to follow up on the discussion on mentorship, what are some ways your mentors can help you build your reputation, and how can you help build the reputation of the scientists you are mentoring?
I'd say connections, introductions. So people who are more senior than you can introduce you up, and you can introduce the people that you're mentoring up as well. So networking and introductions is always useful, but it's easier to network on your own at your level, and it's harder to reach up because, as Jim and as everybody acknowledged, email is a constant flood. You get an email from someone that you don't know, and it starts with, "I'm a student." It's going to be a little lower on your priority list because you have your own students and but if it comes from a colleague, somebody at your level saying, "Hey, I'd like you to meet my student. We're working on it," it gets treated differently. Unfortunately, I wish everybody got exactly the same level of attention, but to help introduce people to each other, I think is extremely valuable.
Yeah, 100%. That's exactly what I was going to say. So I'm not going to add anything to that.
Well, I'd just say one thing, which is actually being a mentee and a mentor. It's fundamentally unidirectional, but it's not, because the mentor needs information from you as to what you need, and they can give you experiences and they can give you advice, but they can only do that, unless you've arranged to meet with them every other Friday or whatever. And the other aspect to that is that it's mentorship is for life, and people forget it's not for a given period of time, because you really want to be, hopefully what you're wanting to be doing is to be impressing your mentors, and you impress them by taking their advice and showing that, because nothing will make them feel better than them thinking they've helped you, which they have, and in large part they will help you, but you will get out of a mentor what really you put into them, and vice versa. So it's a very mutual type of relationship, and often it's very formal, and initially it's very uncomfortable, because there's usually this power dynamic, which again is part of it, but they are there to help you. It's part of their job, and it reflects on them how well you do. So it goes both ways.
Jim, Vardit, and Peter, thank you so much. We are out of time. I can't believe we spoke for 2 hours. Thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts and tips and suggestions on how to build your reputation, and the importance of building a good reputation through whatever mechanisms that seems comfortable for you. So thank you again very, very much for your time. Before we end this session, I'd just like to make a few quick announcements. First, be sure to join us for our final session next Wednesday, April 14th, on building your national and international networks, moderated by our one and only Dr. Nika Shakiba, with expert panelists from Drs. Penny Gilbert, Fabio Rossi, and Bernard Thibault. Also in this session, we will be hearing a special keynote talk by Dr. Jeff Karp, entitled From Bench to Bedside to Marketplace. Next, a key take-home message in the session today, I hope you all learned, was you need to increase your visibility in the academic and non-academic community. So as you have already heard, Stem Cell Network has an incredible opportunity for ECIs to increase their visibility this year at the 2021 Tillum McCulloch meetings. Stem Cell Network is excited to announce the launch of the 2021 TMM Early Career Investigator Speaker Competition. This competition will provide up to 3 early career investigators with the opportunity to present progress in their research programs to the broad stem cell and regenerative medicine community at the 2021 TMM meetings in November, in a pre-recorded session that will be available on demand viewing by all TMM 2021 attendees during and after the conference. So all eligible ECIs are invited to submit an abstract outlining their research project relevant to stem cells and regenerative medicine that will form the basis of their talk. The deadline for the abstract is Friday, April 30th, 2021, 11:59 Pacific time. If you have any questions, please email John Draper at jdraper@stemcellnetwork.ca. And with that, Janice, is there anything else I'm missing?
Thank you, Amy, for being a great moderator.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Amy. That was fantastic.
Thank
Thank
you
you
all.
very much, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.